China just took control of 5 shipping routes that run the entire world and almost nobody noticed it happening. You didn't hear about it in a single headline. There was no invasion, no treaty, no declaration. While you were watching missiles light up the Red Sea and news anchors panic over blocked canals, China was doing something far more calculated. It was buying ports, building terminals, planting its flag at every single doorway global trade has to walk through. And by the time the world started paying attention, China was already inside. This is how they did it. The game nobody told you. You've been thinking about this the wrong way, and so has almost everyone else. When most people imagine one country seizing control of global shipping, they picture warships cutting through open water, naval blockades, missiles launched from destroyer decks, flags planted on disputed islands in the South China Sea. That's the version of power that makes the news, fills the headlines, and keeps defense analysts talking for weeks. It's dramatic, it's visible, and it's exactly what China wants you to be watching, because while your eyes are on the military theater, the real game is being played somewhere quieter. You don't need to own the ocean to control what moves through it. You just need to own the doors. Right now, 80% of everything you buy, wear, eat, or use pass through a narrow stretch of water at some point before it reached you. 80%. That's not just oil tankers and bulk carriers. That's your phone, your medication, your car parts, your groceries, the clothes on your back. Almost everything that makes your modern life function flows through just a handful of choke points scattered across the globe. Narrow straits, critical canals, bottleneck passages where the entire nervous system of world trade compresses into a corridor sometimes just 20 miles wide. And here's what nobody is saying loudly enough: whoever controls the infrastructure surrounding those choke points doesn't just move cargo. They decide how fast it moves. They determine which routes get priority when capacity gets tight. They choose which countries get served first when a crisis hits, and not every ship can get through. That's not a logistics advantage. That's geopolitical leverage dressed up in a hard hat and a port authority badge. China figured this out decades before the rest of the world took it seriously. While Western governments were negotiating trade agreements and filing dispute paperwork at the World Trade Organization, China was doing something far more permanent. It was building, investing, acquiring. It was dispatching state-backed companies with deep pockets and longer time horizons than any private investor would tolerate, and it was embedding them into the physical skeleton of global commerce port by port, terminal by terminal, crane by crane, economic zone by economic zone. This wasn't reactive. It wasn't opportunistic deal-making. It was a deliberate, decades-long infrastructure strategy, executed with the patience of a government that doesn't answer to election cycles or quarterly earnings calls. Every acquisition made sense on its own. Every port deal looked like normal foreign investment. But zoom out. Look at the map of where China now holds port presence or infrastructure stakes, and the pattern becomes impossible to mistake. China didn't scatter its investments randomly. It planted them at the 5 most critical choke points on Earth. And the first one, it locked down, sits at the crossroads of 3 continents, a canal responsible for nearly 12% of all global trade every single day. The Suez Shortcut. You know the Suez Canal. But you probably have no idea who's actually running the infrastructure around it. The canal itself flies an Egyptian flag. That part isn't in dispute. Egypt controls the waterway, collects the tolls, and manages the passage of the roughly 50 ships that transit it every single day. But here's what the geography lesson never told you. A canal is only as powerful as the ports, terminals, and logistics networks that feed into it. The water is just water. The real power sits on the edges in the terminals where cargo is loaded and offloaded, in the economic zones where goods are stored and sorted, in the cranes and the container yards, and the warehousing networks that turn a canal crossing into a functioning supply chain. And when you look at who controls those edges around Suez, one name keeps appearing with striking consistency: COSCO Shipping. One of China's largest state-owned enterprises and one of the biggest shipping companies on the planet, holds a majority stake in the Piraeus port in Greece. Piraeus isn't just any port. It's the primary Mediterranean gateway for cargo heading toward the Suez Canal from Europe, and for Asian goods flowing off container ships into European distribution networks. China didn't acquire Piraeus quietly. It turned it into the fastest-growing container port in the world after taking operational control, investing over $1 billion into expansion and modernization. European officials watched it happen and spent years debating whether to be impressed or alarmed. On the Red Sea side of Suez, Chinese companies have invested heavily in Egypt's Ain Sokhna port, the deep-water facility that sits at the southern entrance of the canal corridor. And inside the Suez Canal economic zone itself, Chinese-backed industrial and logistics development covers over 460 square miles of infrastructure. 460 square miles. You heard that right, that's larger than the entire city of Chicago. Planted right at the throat of the world's most important waterway. Built and operated with Chinese capital and Chinese involvement. Then came March of 2021. The Ever Given, a 400-meter container ship, ran aground and blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days. Global trade froze. An estimated $9.6 billion worth of cargo sat motionless every single day. Companies scrambled to reroute. Supply chains that had no slack in them snapped under the pressure. It was the most visible demonstration in modern history of just how fragile the world's dependence on a single choke point actually is. But China's logistics network, with its port presence threaded across the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the canal's economic zones, had more flexibility to absorb and reroute than almost any other player. While boardrooms in Europe and America were in crisis mode, Chinese operators were adjusting. That's not luck. That's what positioning looks like when a crisis finally arrives. And the same calculated patience that locked down Suez was applied with equal precision to a strait so indispensable that 1/3 of all global trade runs through it every single day, whether the world likes it or not. Malacca, the unavoidable strait picture. A corridor of water barely 50 miles wide at its narrowest point. Now imagine that 1/3 of everything traded on Earth every year, without exception, has no choice but to squeeze through it. That's the Strait of Malacca. The passage between Malaysia and Indonesia that links the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea is the single most trafficked shipping lane on the planet. More than 80,000 vessels pass through it annually, carrying Middle Eastern oil heading to Asian refineries, electronics flowing out of Chinese factories, raw materials shipped up from Australia and Southeast Asia, and consumer goods bound for every corner of the globe. The numbers are almost too large to feel real until you understand what a closure actually means. If Malacca shuts down, global trade doesn't slow, it seizes. There is no quick alternative. Rerouting around the Indonesian archipelago through the Lombok or Sunda Straits adds days to every voyage and hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional fuel costs per vessel. For time-sensitive cargo, refrigerated goods, just-in-time manufacturing components, energy shipments, those extra days don't just cost money. They collapse supply chains. Every major power on Earth understands this. And China, which depends on Malacca more than almost anyone for its own energy imports and export flows, decided long ago that dependence on a single corridor it doesn't control was an unacceptable vulnerability. So it did what it always does. It built around the problem from every possible angle simultaneously. Chinese capital has flowed into Malaysian port infrastructure for years, embedding Chinese operators into the commercial ecosystem directly on the strait's edge. The Malacca Gateway project, backed by Chinese investment, was designed to establish a deep-water port at the strait's entrance, putting Chinese-linked terminal operations at the mouth of the world's busiest waterway. Meanwhile, in Myanmar, China developed the Kyaukphyu deep-sea port on the Bay of Bengal coast, a facility that gives Chinese cargo a direct Indian Ocean outlet that completely bypasses Malacca. Goods can move from China's Yunnan province overland through Myanmar and straight to a Chinese-operated port on the other side of the peninsula. But China didn't stop at building one bypass. For years, it has studied, funded research into, and quietly advocated for a canal through the Kra Isthmus in southern Thailand, a man-made shortcut that would let ships skip the Strait of Malacca entirely and shave days off Asia-Europe voyages. The Kra Canal hasn't been built yet. But the fact that China has positioned itself to benefit whether it gets built or not, and whether Malacca stays open or closes, tells you everything about how this strategy works. You control access to the strait. You build the alternative around the strait. You fund the bypass that makes the strait optional. And then you make yourself impossible to pressure at any single point because you've covered every angle before the crisis arrives. Then came the detail that made neighboring governments genuinely uncomfortable. Because while China was surrounding Malacca with infrastructure, it was simultaneously making the strait irrelevant for its own most critical supply flows. The China-Myanmar Economic Corridor doesn't just move cargo, it moves oil. Pipelines running parallel to the road network carry Gulf energy directly into China's interior without touching a single shipping lane. For China's energy security, the single biggest reason Malacca matters, the strait is now a choice, not a necessity. You've just watched a country methodically eliminate its own choke point vulnerability while quietly tightening its grip on that same choke point for everyone else. And that exact playbook, surround it, bypass it, embed yourself in it, was running simultaneously at a strait where the stakes aren't just economic. They're existential. Hormuz and the Gulf Handshake. 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. 1 in every 5 barrels of oil consumed anywhere on Earth in your car, your power grid, your heating system squeezes through a waterway just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, with Iran sitting on one side and the Arabian Peninsula on the other. When tensions spike in the Gulf, and they spike constantly, the entire global economy holds its breath. Even a rumor of a Hormuz closure sends oil markets into convulsions. An actual closure would trigger an energy shock that would hit every country on Earth within 72 hours. The United States has spent decades and trillions of dollars maintaining a military presence in the Gulf specifically to prevent that from happening. Carrier strike groups, forward operating bases, bilateral defense agreements with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. It is the most expensive security guarantee in the history of modern geopolitics. America keeps the door open. America pays the bill. And America has done this so consistently that the entire global economy has come to treat it as a permanent fixture of the world order. But while America was funding the security, China was acquiring the real estate next to it. Gwadar, a deep-water port on the southwestern coast of Pakistan, sitting at the mouth of the Gulf of Oman, less than 40 miles from the outer edge of the Strait of Hormuz. China didn't just invest in Gwadar the way a company invests in a promising asset. Under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it built the roads connecting Gwadar to Pakistan's interior, laid the pipelines running alongside them, and threaded $62 billion of infrastructure through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, all to create a direct overland corridor from the Gulf of Oman to China's western provinces. Think about what that actually means. If Hormuz closes tomorrow, if Iran mines the strait, if a military confrontation erupts, if the waterway that 20% of global oil depends on becomes impassable, China has an exit. It can redirect energy flows overland through Pakistan while every other major economy scrambles to find alternatives that don't exist at scale. But then came the move that nobody in Washington saw coming clearly enough. Gulf states themselves, the same countries sheltering under the American security umbrella, began inviting Chinese terminal operators in to modernize and manage their port infrastructure. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Oman, countries that depend on American F-35s and carrier groups for their physical survival, were simultaneously handing Chinese companies operational roles in their most strategically sensitive commercial facilities. America guards the strait. China runs the ports around it. And the Gulf states have decided that in a world where American commitment to the region feels less certain than it once did, having China embedded in your infrastructure is its own kind of insurance policy. The math isn't sentimental, it's strategic. And half a world away, a deal that had been hiding in plain sight for 25 years was about to explode into the open and drag China's entire global port network into the headlines with it. Panama, the canal crisis, for 25 years. One of the most consequential port arrangements in modern history, sat in plain sight, and almost nobody treated it like the story it was. When the United States handed the Panama Canal back to Panamanian control in 1999, A Hong Kong-based conglomerate called Hutchison Whampoa stepped in to operate ports on both ends of the waterway, both ends simultaneously. The Atlantic entrance at Cristobal, the Pacific entrance at Balboa. One company with ownership structures running directly into Chinese business networks sitting at the entry and exit points of the canal that handles 40% of all United States container traffic, 40% of Tanakama. Everything shipped in and out of America passes through a canal where Chinese-linked companies ran the ports for over 2 decades. You heard that right. And for most of those 2 decades, the arrangement barely registered as a mainstream political issue. Here's what that actually means, operationally. Port operators don't just move containers from ships to trucks. They see cargo manifests. They track shipping schedules. They understand in real time which supply chains are running hot, which terminals are bottlenecked, which trade flows are vulnerable to disruption. That data aggregated over years, across thousands of vessel calls, isn't just commercially valuable. It's a precise, continuously updated map of the economic bloodstream of every country using that canal. In the wrong hands, or the strategically positioned ones, it's intelligence that no satellite can replicate. Then, in early 2025, the silence broke. Donald Trump publicly demanded that the United States retake control of the Panama Canal, naming Chinese influence as a direct national security threat. Panama's government pushed back hard, defending its sovereignty. Hutchison Ports moved quickly, announcing a deal to sell its Panama Canal operations to a consortium including BlackRock for roughly $23 billion. The headlines moved on within weeks. But this was just the beginning of the real reckoning. Because the Panama story didn't close a chapter, it forced governments around the world to open ones they'd been avoiding. Allies started auditing their own port arrangements. Defense ministries began asking questions that trade ministries had been waving away for years. And what the reviews found was not reassuring. China's port network had grown to span over 100 terminals across 60 countries. 100 terminals. Not a company chasing profit, a state executing a patient, interlocking infrastructure strategy at every node of global commerce that mattered. And Panama was just the one that finally got loud enough to notice. The political storm swirled, but while cameras focused on one controversial deal in one Central American country, a different choke point was already burning, and China had positioned itself there years before the first missile was ever fired. Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea trap-in. Late 23. The Red Sea stopped being a shipping lane and started being a war zone. Houthi forces in Yemen began launching coordinated drone and missile strikes at commercial vessels transiting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the 20-mile-wide corridor connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, the final passage before ships reached the Suez Canal heading north. The attacks weren't random. They were sustained, escalating, and devastatingly effective at achieving their intended economic disruption. Within weeks, the world's largest shipping companies, Maersk, MSC, CMA CGM, pulled their fleets from the Red Sea entirely and rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope. The detour added 10 to 14 days per voyage and up to $1 million in additional fuel costs per ship. Global shipping rates doubled, then tripled. Insurance premiums for Red Sea transits became nearly prohibitive for smaller operators. European manufacturers started facing part shortages. American retailers began emergency inventory builds at enormous cost. The entire northern trade corridor connecting Asia to Europe through Suez was effectively broken, and the financial bleeding was visible in every quarterly earnings report that followed. The world was genuinely blindsided. China was not. Because in 2017, 6 full years before the first Houthi drone lifted off China, had already opened its first and only overseas military base in Djibouti. A small nation of just 1 million people, sitting at the northern entrance of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, not near the strait, not within striking distance of it, at it. China's naval facility in Djibouti looks directly across the water at the most disrupted shipping corridor on Earth, but the military base was only the most visible layer. Underneath it, China had spent years building Djibouti into one of the most strategically loaded pieces of real estate on the planet. The Dorale container terminal, Chinese operated. The multi-purpose port expansion, Chinese financed. The rail line connecting Djibouti's port network to landlocked Ethiopia, Chinese-built, Chinese-run, moving cargo from East Africa's interior straight to a Chinese-operated coastal terminal. In a nation smaller than the state of New Hampshire, China had constructed an entire logistics ecosystem anchored to one of the world's 5 critical choke points. Then came the detail that no shipping analyst could explain away with coincidence. While Western carriers were hemorrhaging money rerouting 12,000 miles around Africa, Chinese shipping firms continued transiting the Red Sea corridor with strikingly fewer incidents. Houthi leadership issued public statements indicating that Chinese and Russian vessels were not their intended targets. Whether the result of quiet diplomacy, back-channel agreements, or deliberate strategic signaling, the outcome was unmistakable. Your supply chains stretched and snapped. China's kept moving. That is what structural positioning looks like when a crisis finally arrives at the doorstep it was always going to reach. And now that you've seen all 5, the investments, the corridors, the bases, the terminal deals, the bypass routes, the full picture is impossible to look away from. You can't sanction. The infrastructure. Here's what the last 20 years actually built, and why it's unlike anything the world has had to deal with before. 5 choke points, 5 of the most critical maritime passages on Earth. And at every single one, Suez, Malacca, Hormuz, Panama, Bab el-Mandeb, China has built, bought, or embedded itself into the infrastructure surrounding it. Not the water, the ports, the terminals, the cranes, the economic zones, the overland corridors that make each choke point optional for China, while keeping it mandatory for everyone else. But the ports are only half the picture. Because while you were tracking where ships travel, China quietly took control of what the ships are built from and what they carry cargo in. China now manufactures roughly 70% of the world's shipping containers. The steel boxes carrying your electronics, your medicine, your food, your clothing. 70% of them come off Chinese factory floors. You heard that right. And Chinese shipyards now produce more than half of the world's new commercial vessels by gross tonnage. The ships themselves, the boxes they carry, the ports they dock at. China has a hand in all 3 layers simultaneously. Then look up at the cranes on the dock the next time you see footage of any major port. Los Angeles, Rotterdam, Felixstowe, Sydney. There is better than an 80% chance they were manufactured by ZPMC, a Chinese state-owned company that dominates global port crane production. The equipment, physically moving cargo in and out of terminals handling your country's trade, Chinese-built, and in many cases connected to Chinese networks for remote diagnostics, maintenance, and operational data transfer. This is the detail that keeps infrastructure security officials awake. Because here is the fundamental problem with what China has constructed over the past 2 decades. You can sanction a country. You can freeze assets, restrict exports, cut off financial systems. But you cannot easily sanction cranes that are already bolted into your docks. You cannot sanction terminal operating agreements already embedded in your port contracts. You cannot sanction the containers already moving through your own supply chain. China has made itself the landlord of the world's most critical commercial real estate and the manufacturer of the equipment that keeps it running. Every other country is a tenant paying rent in the form of port fees, equipment contracts, and logistics dependency, whether they realize it or not. When a crisis hits a choke point, every other nation scrambles. It reroutes, renegotiates, absorbs the cost, and hopes the disruption ends before the economic damage becomes permanent. China adjusts because it already has infrastructure, presence, and relationships on every side of every bottleneck that matters. That's not shipping dominance. That's not even trade strategy in the conventional sense. That's structural leverage so deeply embedded into the physical world that unwinding it would take decades and cost more than most governments are willing to admit. China didn't take the sea lanes. It did something the world has no clean playbook for. It became the infrastructure. And the most unsettling part isn't what China built. It's that it was all visible the whole time to anyone willing to look at the map.